This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the Rankin Bass cartoon empire. I'm speaking with Rick Goldschmidt, the official biographer of that empire, and the conversation will begin in a moment. I'm speaking with Rick Goldschmidt. He is probably the world's foremost historian on the Rankin Bass enterprises and all of their cartoons and all the stuff made for children. And we're going to talk a little bit about the company. But before we do, let's talk about who Rick Goldschmidt is. I like to give all my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves, say who they are, what they do, etc. So, Rick, thank you for speaking with me. Welcome. And if you could give a little background about, one, who you are, and two, how you got involved with keeping the memory alive of the Rankin Bass stuff.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm the Rankin Bass official historian and biographer, and my degree is in illustration art from Columbia College, Chicago. So I had planned to become a humorous illustrator, similar to the work of Jack Davis. And in fact, that's how I got in touch with Rankin Bass through Jack Davis. He was my favorite illustrator out of Mad Magazine, and he did a lot of other things, movie posters, Time Magazine covers, TV Guide covers. And I asked him whatever happened to Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass, and he said that he was still doing some work for them and that I should talk to Paul Coker Jr., who's another one of my favorite artists. And I gave Paul a call, and somehow he gave me Arthur's phone number in Bermuda. And I called Arthur Rankin up in Bermuda and said, there really should be a book about all of this stuff. And he said, send me 2 chapters, which I did. And he liked it, and that's kind of how I became the Rankin Bass historian.
So regarding your art career, there was a famous caricaturist I know that used to have all of the celebrities on a restaurant wall in New York City. I forget his name. Was he sort of your hero? Al Hirschfeld, I think it was.
Yeah, actually, Al Hirschfeld worked for Rankin Bass as well. He did the movie poster art for The Daydreamer in 1966. And Arthur Rankin was an art director at ABC Television. So he knew quality art, and he only hired the best people in the business. And Hirschfeld, Davis, Coker, and some of the other people he used, Bruce Stark was another. They were all like these phenomenal humorous caricature artists, I would call them. And he just loved their work, and I loved their work. So that was something that Arthur Rankin and I had in common right off the bat.
So let's talk about how the two men met and formed their company. So this would have been in the late 50s. This is before, I guess, the 1960s can be considered sort of the birth date of the holiday film cartoon. You had Rudolph, you had Frosty, you had Charlie Brown, you had the Grinch, you had Mr. Magoo, and a number of other ones. So how did Rankin and Bass meet, and how did they form their partnership?
Well, Arthur was working at ABC Television in New York, and Jules was working at an ad agency. So he would come into ABC periodically, and they struck up a friendship through that. Jules was writing jingles mostly, and that's how he brought Maury Laws into the mix as the musical conductor or composer for Rankin Bass. He was more into the music part of the business, but they became friends, and they were doing mostly commercials in the late 50s, early 60s. And that's kind of how Rudolph developed. They were doing commercials for GE a few years before Rudolph, and they were doing it in Animagic, stop motion animation, which Arthur discovered in Japan, that they could do the kind of animation that Arthur wanted to use for his productions. So they really became known for the animagic, and that's why Rudolph was done in animagic, because they were using it in very short commercials prior to that.
Was it more commercially viable to use the little puppets rather than to do full-on animation like the old Warner Brothers cartoons?
Well, it was about the same as far as cost goes and time goes. It was just the art form that Arthur really that appealed to Arthur, and he knew that it would work well in the United States, um, especially on television, and just decided to work in that art form. And it really was beneficial to their business because when people saw it, they wanted to use that style for their production. So immediately after Rudolph aired in December 6, 1964, they struck up a 3-picture deal with Joseph V. Levine in February of 1965. They also had heard from Edgar Bergen. He wanted to do a Charlie McCarthy and show in Animagic. So, I mean, it led to all the other things that followed in their careers.
Huh.
And it's really what they've become known for,
Yeah.
and what they'll always be known for is the stop motion Animagic.
So, how, if at all, did it differ from other stop motion, whether it would be Ray Harryhausen, his work in horror films of the 50s, 60s, 70s, or for example, I was raised as a Lutheran. I remember the old Davy and Goliath TV show, and also Art Clokey's Gumby. Were they very similar things, or was there specific differences between, say, Gumby and Davy and Harryhausen and the Rankin Bass stuff?
Well, Davy and Goliath is the closest to
Yeah.
the Rankin Bass Animagic.
Yeah.
In fact, I appeared at Chiller Theater a few years ago with one of the original sets of Davy and Goliath. So I love that series. But
Yeah.
I think what Rankin Bass did more than any other studio was they brought personality to stop motion. Now, George Pal did his puppet tunes. Harryhausen did a lot of stop motion for feature films. Art Clokey was doing mostly claymation with Gumby and Pokey, and very simple puppets for Davy and Goliath. But Rankin Bass brought this personality to the art form, not only with famous people like Burl Ives and Fred Astaire and Jimmy Durante and all these other characters, but with the voice actors from Canada that they got for the cast of Rudolph, they really brought personality to each and every character. So you don't really think of them so much as puppets. You think of them more as personalities, like the Heat Miser and Snow Miser and Yukon Cornelius. All of these characters, people think they're real characters. They don't think of them as puppets, and I think that's their key to their success. Is they chose voices that were going to be good for animation. They didn't just choose them for star marquee value. And that was different from anything prior to Rudolph. The characters almost come to life, I guess is the best way to describe it.
Yeah. One of the things that's a hallmark of the Rankin Bass, I will call them films, is not only the stop motion, but the music. You mentioned Maury Laws and all of these sort of infectious holiday songs. Obviously Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and I believe Frosty the Snowman were songs that were then turned into these little films. But most of the rest of the songs were made specifically for each the holiday offerings, correct?
Right, right. And Maury Laws was a genius when it came to holiday entertainment and family entertainment. His music could be in the best Broadway musicals.
Yeah.
You know, the quality to his music was far beyond anything used for children's entertainment prior. So the combination of him and Jules Bass's lyrics, they really, some of the songs that they wrote, like for instance, the soundtrack to Santa Claus is Coming to Town with Put One Foot in Front of the Other and Santa's song, When You Sit on My Lap Today, all the songs have a Broadway musical quality. They're as good as all the songs that were in Mary Poppins or Sound of Music. So that was really something that was much different than, you know, what was being done for children's family entertainment. And Maury Laws, when I first contacted him, he was surprised that I was so interested in hearing the original soundtrack to Mad Monster Party, because in the movie credits it says there was an RCA Victor album, but it never got released, and he had the only copy of that. And when I asked him for it to, you know, to borrow it, to hear it and everything, he was shocked that I even cared about it. So he's very modest and protective of his work. But you know, all of these people came to realize the importance of the work that they did when my first book came out and kind of chronicled the whole career of Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass. They did so many good things. Very few things were failures. So, I mean, Maury Laws' music is going to live on forever. And that's something that I know he was proud of before he passed away.
Now, with Rudolph was the first of the holiday specials that made a big
Right.
impact. There had been some other ones beforehand. What kind of an impact did it have? Because I know when I looked up and been looking up things about Christmas specials, you know, the original Charlie Brown's special was sort of an afterthought, and it took people by surprise that it caught on so much. Was Rudolph expected to be a hit because the song had been around for over 2 decades? Was it expected to be a hit, or was it a surprise?
It was a surprise, not to Arthur, but pretty much to everyone else. Originally, the 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 very first special that Rankin Bass did was Return to Oz for the General Electric Fantasy Hour on NBC. And that went on in February of '64. It was cell animated. That was expected to be the big show,
Yeah.
because Wizard of Oz was rebroadcast every year, I believe, on CBS, and it brought in great ratings for television. This was the first time that somebody attempted to do a similar, not a sequel, but another production with all the same characters. And they thought that was going to be the big hit. Rudolph was seen more as a way to advertise the General Electric houseware division products. You know, clocks, irons, hair dryers, and so forth. So they were looking more at that as a children's production that would advertise all of these different products, and it was only expected to run 2 years.
Yeah.
And when it aired, it just was such a big hit that Arthur Rankin's phone was ringing off the hook. So they were able to get all these other things lined up just based on that first airing of Rudolph. They did another special for the General Electric Fantasy Hour that came out 2 years later, The Ballad of Smokey the Bear.
Mm.
And they had to get permission from the president to do that special. And James Cagney was the main star of it. And they thought that was going to be a huge hit, but it wasn't.
Mm.
Rudolph just continued to get bigger and bigger every time they aired it. And that's what led to all the other Christmas specials, The Little Drummer Boy and Santa Claus is Coming to Town and so forth.
So I've read that and seen some videos online stating that maybe the first year or two, that first 2 years, they aired the Rudolph without the end credits going back to the Island of Misfit Toys, and it was because children's I guess supposedly wanted the Misfit Toys to find homes that they filmed the last end credit minute and a half, whatever it was. Is that correct?
Well, that that came out of stuff that I wrote about years ago.
Uh-huh.
Jules Bass seemed to remember that there was some write-in campaign, but I don't think that's true, because Rudolph, when it aired in '64, it aired at 4:30. I think it might have been on the East Coast at 4:30, maybe 5:30 my time, and Central Coast. But I don't think kids wrote in to NBC saying, we want to see the Misfit Toys get picked up.
No.
What happened was Willard Saloff, who was the person at GE that Rankin Bass dealt with, he decided he wanted to make some changes the next year in '65. He wanted a new song, and he wanted the ending to have the Misfit Toys dropped off with the umbrellas, which is very similar to the Flintstones Christmas episode, where they're getting dropped, all the toys are getting dropped off with umbrellas. I don't know which one inspired which, but they're very similar. Willard Saloff decided he wanted a new song, and the only way they could put a new song in is taking one of the old ones out. So they replaced We're a Couple of Misfits with Fame and Fortune, and that's the way it stayed all the way till 1998. Fame and Fortune was in the special, so I grew up watching Fame and Fortune. And then the end credits were changed and never changed back. They're around the campfire and they get picked up by Santa. But that wasn't from a writing campaign. And I've seen people share at Christmas time, people saying that and so forth. But that just came out of some of my earlier writings. Over the years, I've discovered a lot of things about Rudolph that I didn't know for sure back when I started. And another one is the Rudolph and Santa puppets that I toured with, that my friend restored, Kevin Kreis from Time and Space Toys. Those puppets were never used in the actual animation. They were only used for publicity photographs. And then there was a display case that NBC put together in Rockefeller Plaza that mostly school children would tour through NBC to see, how television was made, and then they get to see the cast of the Rudolph characters. And I got a photograph of that display case a few years ago and put it in my new book, the Rankin Bass's The Year Without a Santa Claus and 'Twas the Night Before Christmas 50th Anniversary Scrapbook. So I'm always learning new things about Rudolph and confirming things that other people have told me. every year I find new stuff about Rudolph.
So Rick, I've just looked up here on an article on Wikipedia, which I know is not reliable, but it seems that the cricket on the hearth, I was the next thing they did after Rudolph. It wasn't one of the puppet ones, because in my mind I remember the story. Wasn't that regular animation?
Right, right. And it actually appeared in the context of the Danny Thomas show.
Ah,
It was an episode of the Danny Thomas show, and Marlo Thomas appears in it and sings a couple of songs, which she isn't really known for her singing, but she did a really good job on that. The animation was done at Toei Studios. They used Toei for the King Kong show, and then they used Toei for Mouse on the Mayflower. And Toei didn't quite capture the look of the Rankin Bass style. Not until Frosty the Snowman in '69 did the Rankin Bass style in cell animation really develop. Paul Coker Jr. did the artwork and the lettering and so forth, and they hired Mushi Studios. And Mushi did a far better job at capturing the Paul Coker look.
yeah.
And that's kind of what Rankin Bass is known for. They did the Festival of Family Classics and, Frosty's Winter Wonderland later on, and many other cell things. 'Twas the Night Before Christmas.
Yeah.
All of those cell animated things look really, really good and capture the essence of Paul Coker Jr.
Yeah, those names of some of those shows I haven't seen in 40, 50 years or more. So was Little Drummer Boy the next one, Animagic?
Right. And that was a huge hit.
Now I have to ask, because I know with the Charlie Brown Christmas special, some of the CBS people were worried about an overtly religious, thing. That's why you had the whole thing about Christmas being commercialized. Here we go from Santa and Rudolph to going back to 2,000 years to the Bethlehem, I guess it's set in. Was there any worry about it being too overtly religious?
Not from NBC, because that's what Christmas is all about, and they got Greer Garson to narrate it, and that gave it a really high element of class. And Teddy Eccles was the voice of Aaron, and it's just a great Christmas special. I recall when I was young, in the early '70s, NBC would take out a full-page ad in the Tribune, in the Chicago Tribune. So they were really still promoting it into the '70s.
Mm-hmm.
I think the worry about the content of the special came towards the end of the '70s and into the '80s. It kind of disappeared from the networks. The only way you could see it was on videotape.
Yeah.
And they sort of brought it back in recent years, where they make it part of AMC's Rankin Bass Weekend or whatever.
Yeah.
So they're not terribly afraid of putting it on cable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's out on Blu-ray and DVD, but the Universal bought all of the Rankin Bass early specials, and they've wrecked a lot of different releases, and The Little Drummer Boy is one of the ones that they totally wrecked, because in the middle of scenes, it's fading to black. Like there's an extra commercials coming in, and they didn't remaster the special. They didn't go back to the negative. They're still showing like a 16 millimeter Blu-ray transfer, so it's totally wrecked.
Oh.
But hopefully one day it'll get restored and put out on Blu-ray. But I think that might take another company buying them from Universal.
So was it then after Drummer Boy? Then it's to Frosty the Snowman, which is fully animated. Was that the
Right,
next?
right. And Frosty the Snowman is interesting because the first 3 or 4 screenings of it on CBS, Karen, the little girl that was
Yeah.
Frosty's friend, was voiced by June Foray.
Ah,
And
Rocket J Squirrel.
yeah, and I was a really close friend with June Foray. She
Ah.
was one of the people that I just hit it off with right
Mm.
away, and we stayed in close touch until towards the end of her life. And she didn't know why they changed the voice. I had to kind of figure it out myself. Arthur couldn't remember. Maury Laws couldn't remember. Nobody could remember why they changed their voice to Karen. The reason they did it was someone at CBS, a CBS executive, decided to change the voice. And he had this little girl named Susan Davidson, who that year, I think it was 73, they did a remake of Miracle on 34th Street with Sebastian Cabot. And it had a pretty big budget for a television movie.
Yeah.
Roddy McDowell was in it, and a whole bunch of really well-known people. And someone at CBS just decided, this little girl is a great actor or actress. Let's change the voice in Frosty, because I wasn't too terribly happy with that. I wanted to be a real little girl. So they must have did it in a studio and just told Arthur and Jules that they were going to do it, and they were okay with it because the special was still airing, so they were making the revenue off of it. So I don't think they really cared that they were going to change the voice.
So then it looks like the next one in 1970 was Santa Claus is Coming to Town, with Mickey Rooney supplying the voice. And
Right.
And the thing that's interesting here is that he's known through most of that episode, show, as Kris Kringle. And so I'm wondering, it doesn't matter to me, because as a child I always accepted each show on its own merit. But nowadays, with science fiction and horror franchises and whatnot, people think of the Rankin Bass universe. And it seems that, for example, the Santa Claus that appears with Rudolph is different than the animated Santa Claus that saves Frosty, which is different from the Kris Kringle Santa Claus of Santa Claus is Coming to Town. So was there any effort made at all to try to sync up all of these Rankin Bass productions, to have a common universe, or was it just sort of like TV shows of the day where you didn't have Gilligan's Island, there wasn't any one episode didn't affect an episode 2 years later that contradicted it?
Well, here's the reason for what you're talking about. They got Rudolph on NBC because there was a guy named Larry Romer who was part of the Rankin Bass group. And he had a friend that worked at NBC. So he was able to get his friend to get Rudolph on the air. And what happened was they stuck with NBC because of this relationship. That's why Cricket on the Hearth was done for the Danny Thomas show. That's why The Little Drummer Boy was on NBC, and Mouse on the Mayflower was on NBC. But their friendship with Larry Romer soured very badly during Rudolph, and eventually they fired Larry Romer. So when they did that, they started going around to the other two networks. They got Frosty on CBS, and they got Santa Claus is Coming to Town on ABC. So now they had all three networks showing their programs. And what happened with that was NBC wanted a certain look and grouping of specials that wasn't like CBS's and wasn't like ABC's. So when they did the sequel to Frosty, it went on ABC. And that's why Karen, Hinkle, and Hocus Pocus aren't in Frosty's Winter Wonderland. Because ABC wanted their own version of Frosty with Andy Griffith. So I think the reason they changed the Santas for the various specials was because they were all on different networks.
That makes sense. Perverse kind of sense, but yeah, it sort of makes sense because you don't want to be on CBS promoting something that's going to air on NBC.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So then it looks like after that, Here Comes Peter Cottontail. We expanded just from Christmas. Now we're tackling Easter.
Right, and that's actually, I would put that in my top 5 Rankin Bass specials because the soundtrack is amazing, and the voice cast, just like Santa Claus is Coming to Town, is amazing. Casey Kasem as Peter Cottontail and Vincent Price as Evil Irontail. The Vincent Price performance character, Irontail, in Here Comes Peter Cottontail is the one thing I can point at that created Tim Burton.
Oh, okay.
Tim Burton was a huge Vincent Price fan, but he became this gothic artist and movie maker based off of that one character, Evil Irontail in Here Comes Peter Cottontail. I think that had the most impact on Tim Burton than anything. Yeah. But to me, Santa Claus is Coming to Town and Here Comes Peter Cottontail was the absolute high point of Rankin Bass's career.
Yeah.
The music, the characters, the animation, everything was perfect in those two specials. And then it kind of sort of sloped downward after that. Not a drastic slope, but things after that were kind of rehashing everything that they did prior.
Yeah. Well, rare is the thing with Vincent Price in it that wasn't good. Even in old films like Laura, he's terrific. I interviewed his daughter, Victoria, 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, I appear with Victoria at Chiller Theater pretty much every year. And there's so many great things that Vincent Price did in his career. I mean, he was in Batman too.
Yeah. And he was great on the Hollywood Squares, but
right.
Yeah, but right. Let's talk about the next one here. It was The Year Without a Santa Claus, and this sort of sticks with the whole thing, I guess, because of the networks. This is a big contradictory to the other portrayals of Santa Claus, but it introduces probably two totally, I guess they're totally made-up characters, Heat and Snow Miser, and probably that's got to be one of the top 5 songs that people remember from all the Rankin Bass specials. You know, Mr. 10 Below and 101.
Well, that was my most recent book, so it's the freshest in my memory.
Yeah.
And what's funny about that special is Arthur took a Pulitzer Prize-winning children's book called The Year Without a Santa Claus into ABC and said, here's our next special. So in the book, it's only a book about Santa not wanting to go out for Christmas.
Yeah.
You know, because he feels like everyone, gave up on on Christmas. You know, they don't really believe in him so much anymore.
Yeah.
And that was the context of the story. But that's not what people remember about the special. Most people couldn't, when I first started my work as the historian, most people couldn't name the special. They couldn't remember the name, but they remembered the Heat Miser and Snow Miser.
Yeah.
And those were totally created by Rankin Bass. And in many ways, they kind of represent Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass because they were very different people. Arthur was more outgoing and driven and really the guy in charge. And Jules was more antisocial. Yeah. He wasn't very much in charge. And, you know, they were kind of like opposites. And they represent the men, Arthur and Jules, to me. And they're the most famous. I would say they're even more famous than Rudolph and Frosty.
Yeah.
That's what most people think of when they think of Rankin Bass now.
Yeah, well, I mean, they were great production numbers. They could have come out of a 1930s or 40s musical.
Right. And, you know, the soundtrack of that one is really good, too.
Yeah.
Maury Loss used to say that his favorite specials were the ones with Mickey Rooney in them. And that's because the songs were so good.
Yeah. So then by the late 70s, it looks like we were getting a slew of sort of mix and match of Frosty came back for a couple of specials. Rudolph had the New Year's special, and then he had a special with Frosty. And it's sort of getting sort of like the DC comic books where Superman and Batman would team up, and or maybe you'd get Spider-Man coming over from Marvel. You like you said, creatively, they sort of just started repeating themselves.
Yeah, and a lot of that is because Arthur Rankin, his dream was to make feature films, not animated feature films either, feature films. And Jules' dream was to make Broadway musicals. And in the late 60s, 68 or so, they did an off-Broadway musical called A Month of Sundays. And they had high hopes for that musical, and it bombed.
Yeah.
It only lasted like 10 performances, and Maury told me Jules was never the same after that. It was such a disappointment. Now, while they were making these sequels, Rudolph's Shiny New Year, Pinocchio's Christmas, and so forth, Arthur was making films for ABC Friday Night Movie. He made the Bermuda Depths in Bermuda because he lived in Bermuda. He made the Ivory 8 with Jack Palance in Bermuda. He made The Last Dinosaur with Richard Boone and Joan
Crawford?
Get her name.
No.
But he made a lot of these movies, and they were kind of low budget movies, only made primarily for television, although some of them were cut and made into feature films for the foreign market. But Arthur's dream was to make a big budget feature film, and he never quite did that. The closest they came was they made a cell animated movie called The Last Unicorn, which when it came out in 82, I remember Ebert and Siskel gave it a thumbs up, both of them, which was hard to do. It was very difficult to do an animated movie and not be Walt Disney and have it succeed. And that was a mild hit for them.
So I'm looking at some of, holy cow, I just saw something that on another show a couple of weeks ago, I asked a fellow about ABC, a fellow that Mitch Hadley. We do some shows together. Uh, I was talking about there was a Saturday morning cartoon series, Willie Mays and the Say Hey Kid. I remember that one. That was Rankin Bass?
Yeah, it's funny you
Wow.
mentioned that. Because of the Willie Mays to Say Hey Kid, the Louisville Slugger Bat Museum came to my home to take a lot of my collectibles and set it up at their museum
Mm.
at Christmas time because they put the Willie Mays and the Say Hey Kid on a loop on a
Mm.
television set, and that was sort of their tie-in to baseball. And right at that time, not too long before that, Maury Laws did a Broadway thing with the Hall of Fame, the Baseball Hall of Fame, did some type of a musical thing with Dave Winfield that Maury wrote new music for. And that was supposed to lead into a Rankin Bass Broadway musical type of thing that I was going to be involved with. So there's so many different things that Rankin Bass did that lead to other things.
Mm.
And Willie Mays did that for me because I never would have had my collection exhibited at the Louisville Slugger Bat Museum had they not done that with Willie Mays.
So I remember that was part of, I think, like the ABC Saturday morning movies thing for a
Right.
couple of years, and I think it added like 11 a.m. or noon on Saturdays. Did they do any of the other ones? Because I know there was about maybe two
Yes.
dozens. Which ones did they do?
They did the Red Baron,
Ah,
Mad, Mad, Mad Monsters,
ah,
That Girl in Wonderland with Marlo Thomas again,
yes.
and I think one or two others. Now, here's something I just found out about, and I also put it in my new book. When they became friends with Michael Eisner,
Mm.
that's why they were doing so much at ABC and did the ABC Saturday Superstar movie.
Yeah.
And originally, Michael Eisner and Arthur Rankin were discussing a Rankin Bass Halloween special.
Mm-hmm.
And what they were going to do was take the Mad Monster Party movie and edit it down to a 1 hour special and have Vincent Price host it.
Ah.
And they even did the poster artwork, which I put in my book, where it says Vincent Price is the host. So they were going to use a Vincent Price Animagic puppet and have him hosting Mad Monster Party. But instead, they made Mad Monsters in cell animation and put it on the ABC Superstar movie. There was another series that they did one episode for, and it came right after Here Comes Peter Cottontail. The Enchanted World of Danny Kaye was going to be a series of specials that was like that ABC Saturday Superstar movie. So in other words, they would have a different special periodically as part of the Enchanted World of Danny Kaye. And that's where the Mad Monster Party special probably would have been part of that.
Mm. Yeah, so clearly the early 70s, from 70 to 75 or so, was, as you said, the golden age there. I mean, it had the most memorable things. I mean, yeah, Frosty and Rudolph were great in the 60s, but in terms of the most memorable era of creating the most number of memorable shows, certainly the early 70s, I would agree, was their peak.
Yeah, and there's one other thing they did in the early 70s that I sometimes I forget about it. They did a feature film called Marco with Desi Arnaz Jr.
Huh.
And that was a combination, as I mentioned, Jules Bass wanted to do Broadway musicals. It's a Broadway musical type of film, but it has a big budget look with the sets.
Yeah.
I think Marco was the film that Arthur thought, this is going to be my big hit. This is going to be my big movie. And Jules thought, this is going to be my big musical. And it didn't do very well. It's not a bad movie.
Yeah.
It's kind of slow, and it has an animagic segment in it called Peace Berries, which is really very good. Um, but they never quite got to um, that big budget movie that they wanted to get to. But Marco was, I guess, it was kind of close to that.
So let's talk about the late 70s because there's one thing that really stands out that I want to ask you about. But let's just talk. I had mentioned how they started repeating themselves, mixing and matching Rudolph and
Right.
Frosty, and there was a lot of things like the Little Drummer Boy 2, the first Easter Rabbit, the first this, the first that, the Stingiest Man in Town, Rudolph and Frosty's Christmas in July, Jack Frost. To me, the one that stands out as the special that shows that they were running on fumes was Nestor the Long-Eared Donkey, and it's because not that it's a terrible piece of work, but it basically is a 2,000-year-old rehash or mixing of the drummer boy with Rudolph because you have an animal that has a deformity, the long ears versus the
Right.
red nose. Uh, he tries to the effort is to teach about acceptance and all this stuff, but it then trods basically the same stuff that we saw in the drummer boy stuff. Would you agree that this was a good example of them just rehashing?
Well, there's a lot of people that love that
Yeah.
special. It's also similar to Bambi with the mother
Mm.
dying, and some people say that it makes them cry and they can't watch that and so on and so forth. But I still think with Roger Miller being the host and the songs in it, um, it's very, very watchable for me. So that's one of the specials I actually watch at Christmas time because I enjoy it. I don't really care that it rehashes the Little Drummer Boy and Rudolph, like you said. It does. I just enjoy that one. And I know that if there are little Nestor figures made, people are going to buy them.
Yeah.
There's a demand for that. But yeah, they started mixing and matching, like you said, because their heart really wasn't into the Christmas specials anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Then they went into fantasy
Yeah.
works, and The Hobbit was
That's what
a
I was going to
total.
mention. Yeah.
They took something that was everyone was reading the Hobbit
Right.
book at that time.
Yeah.
And they wanted to see what it looked like on television. So that was a very highly anticipated special. And for Rankin Bass to hire artists that took the imagery from the book and really captured it, they didn't use Paul Coker Jr. on that. And they didn't want it to look like the Christmas stuff. They went very, very literal to the book, and they ended up winning a Peabody and a Christopher Award for that.
Yeah.
So that was huge for
Now,
their career.
that came out before Ralph Bakshi's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, correct?
Right. And then they did The Return of the King, which was on the ABC Friday night movie when it first aired. And it combined 2 or 3 of the books into The Return of the King. And for that reason, Arthur didn't think it was successful. He didn't like Return of the King. But The Hobbit, most people, now I went to Sundance Film Festival because of The Hobbit. There was a movie made about the phenomenon of Tolkien, and I helped with it. It's a documentary, And so I went to Sundance because of Rankin Bass's The Hobbit. And most fans feel to this day that that special captured the book far better than the movies that Peter Jackson made
I would agree.
later.
I agree. Yeah. And I also thought, and I was also a big fan of Bakshi's version, even though it only presented the first book as well. I thought the Peter Jackson stuff, was good and whatnot, but not that I was ever a great Tolkien fan, but I absolutely agree that the animated both Bakshi and the Rankin Bass animation ones, to me, they stick in my mind far more than Jackson's films now 20 years
Right.
on. Um,
Right.
so the 1980s, then it seemed they were really running out of steam. Probably the only thing that, just looking at it, that sticks in my mind as something just I wanted to mention is The Wind in the Willows, because I remember there was, I believe, a PBS television show that came on in the mid 90s that tackled that, and it was quite good. This was fully animated, though, The Wind in the Willows?
Yeah. Yes, and it had great voice actors in it. Charles Nelson Riley, um, bunch of people in that cast. I think Roddy McDowell was in that one too, and he was in Cricket on the Hearth. So, I mean, they had phenomenal voice actors working on that stuff, and that was a pretty good success. And they had other successes in the early 80s as well. But then they kind of reinvented themselves with Thundercats, Silverhawks, and the comic strip, which spawned Tiger Sharks.
Mm.
In the mid 80s, this is when I was in college.
Mm-hmm.
There was a combination animation toy marriage that was hot in the mid 80s,
Yeah.
probably because of Star Wars.
Well, yeah, you had the Smurfs. They were also big Smurfs, and you had He-Man, and you had G.I.
Right.
Joe.
Right. So, Thundercats, and I just talked about this in an article I wrote for Remind Magazine, because Thundercats just turned 40 a few days ago. And their approach to Thundercats was they hired a psychologist to help with the writing of the show so that it would be more in tune with development of children. Because in the 60s, they had all these groups come out and say television was too violent, especially Saturday morning cartoons, where they had to tone it down so much that when they did Super Friends in the early 70s, they weren't fighting with villains anymore.
Yeah.
They were basically just flying and driving and swimming around.
Yeah.
And
they always had like kids, like they had the Wonder Twins, Wonder Twin powers, and they had Marvin and his little dog, which were like Scooby-Doo ripoffs.
Right. So Thundercats had this idea that this was going to be good for your children.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they sold a lot of toys. It was a marketing thing to tie the show into toys, which I don't think they would allow today as much. I read in the synopsis of Thundercats that they couldn't do it within the context of the show. They couldn't have, any kind of merchandise be mentioned or sold in the show itself. But it was obviously a promotion to sell toys. And because of that, it is well remembered by that generation of kids that grew up, and they constantly want new Thundercats material, toys and everything else. So it's very odd that the company that created Rudolph and Frosty and all of that got into superhero type animation, anime,
Yeah.
if you will. And I wouldn't have thought it was the same company if I wasn't that familiar with their career.
Yeah.
But they want to make movies out of this stuff now.
Well,
They probably will make a Thundercats movie in the near future.
yeah,
So,
the Thundercats also, though, seem to be the Rankin Bass answer to, I don't know who did He-Man, but he was big at the time. Because both of them had the magic swords. Both of them had, I think there was Skeletor, and then there was Mum-Ra, who was a mummy.
right.
For that. Because I was too old to see it in its original run in the mid-'80s. I was 20 already. So I might have seen 2 or 3 episodes when I got home from work or something and just eating some cereal. But about 20 years ago in the aughts, I had ordered the DVD of the Odd Couple TV show, because I love Jack Klugman and Tony Randall. But instead, they sent me a Thundercats box set. So while I was waiting to return it, this is 20 years ago, so you'd have to wait to get something in the mail to mail it back. Over the course of a week or so, and the night, I watched maybe not all of them, maybe several dozen of the episodes of Thundercats, and it seemed to me that at some times they were really just pushing a lot of sugary messaging, but it seemed that the show itself had an interesting basis. As I recall, the cat people, or whatever you called them, their planet blew up just like Superman's planet blew up, and they come. No, Third Earth is He-Man, I think. They come to is it Thundera Prime or is it Third Earth? I don't remember.
Yeah. I'm not that big of a fan of the show because it was after my time of television watching, like you said.
Yeah, but it seemed to me that they had the makings of setting up the characters, but then after the first 2 or 3 episodes, that went away, and all it just became was like, be kind to strangers, don't pick on people who look differently, or that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was the thing of the day. Now, back in the mid '70s, when I was watching Saturday morning stuff, my friend Jackson Bostwick was in the show Shazam, which had the same exact message. It was like the episode was about something where kids learn about how to behave.
Yeah.
And then at the end, Jackson would come out and talk about the moral of the story.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was exactly like that in Thundercats as well, only 10 years later.
Yeah. Well, I remember the Shazam was mixed with, what was it, ISIS? And the actress Joanna Cameron. My God, was she gorgeous. I was, as a 9-10-year-old boy, I was like, every time I got to see that ISIS girl.
Right. So, yeah, television, especially Saturday morning, never really came back to the way it was in the 60s, where it was explosions and fighting and all kinds of different things. They kind of got on this message kick for about a good 20 years until it just disappeared altogether.
Yeah.
So now there isn't really a Saturday morning cartoon anymore.
So just to sort of wrap up, let's talk. So what was the ending for Rankin and Bass? Did the company just sort of fade away? Did they part amicably, or did it last until their deaths?
Well, Arthur and Jules parted ways in like '87. And it wasn't a really amicable parting of ways either, as they described it to me. I found out it was kind of they really couldn't work together anymore, but they remained friends till the end. And Arthur was such a workaholic that he kept his hand in the fire with, he wanted to get The King and I produced, which he did eventually through a company called Morgan Creek. But it was so different from what he had envisioned. It really was sort of a sacrificial release. And then they did another television special called Santa Baby, and it had some of the elements, like Paul Coker Jr. did the designs, but it didn't really look very good, and it didn't capture the essence of Rankin Bass. So even though Arthur kept working and working and wanting to work, he even wanted to make Santa Baby into a stage play at the very end of his life. They never really quite could recapture what they had already done, but that was okay. When my books came out, they really celebrated their career, and they realized, you know, we never did make that big movie we wanted to make or the big musical, but we were very successful with Rudolph and Frosty and so many things. You know, they did the Jackson 5 show and the Osmond show.
Yeah.
And Donny Osmond credits Rankin Bass with giving their career such a boost that had they not done the animated series of the Osmonds, they probably wouldn't have been as successful as they were. And that says a lot about the power of what Rankin Bass was doing all those, I would say, through the 60s and 70s.
Well, I didn't even realize that the Osmonds and Jackson 5 were both Rankin Bass.
Right.
Ah.
Yeah. They worked with a company called Alice and Batchelor out of England, who I think they did work on the Yellow Submarine, the Beatles movie. And I remember watching the Jackson 5 and the Osmonds, and I remember thinking, you know, this is sort of a phenomenon like the Beatles.
Yeah.
You know, it really, they have their own show and they're playing all their songs. They're like commercials for the records. So it really made me like the Osmonds and the Jackson 5. And I think Donnie's right. Had that show not been made, they wouldn't have been as successful as they were. So Rankin Bass had a lot of things that were successful. And when Arthur and Jules look back on their career and realize, you know, we did a lot of good things, they're going to be remembered forever. And they're, to me,
if you look at all their songs, I mean, their catalog is as deep as any of the great Broadway teams like Lerner and Lowe, or the guys who did West Side Story. I mean, you know, you're talking Rudolph and Frosty and the Miser song and you know, at least a half a dozen others that everyone from that's ever seen them remembers.
Right. And you know, I think they'll be remembered forever because they just found their niche in especially in the holiday animation.
Yeah.
And to me, the reason I did the first book, I wasn't going to be an author and work on books. But the reason I did the first book was, to me, they were as important as Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera, or Chuck Jones, or Walt Disney. There's only a handful of animation studios that I could think of that had such an impact on pop culture, and Rankin Bass is one of those studios.
Yeah, I could think of the Croft brothers, Sid and Marty Croft.
Oh yeah, Sid and Marty Croft. I occasionally I talk to Sid, and I wanted to do a real big coffee table book on them as well. There's never really been a book that really showcases their work like I would like to do it, but I mean, yeah, there's only a handful of people like that.
So
Do
who is in charge of the Rankin Bass property now, the intellectual property that if they make out a DVD, who gets the money? Is it Rankin and Bass's heirs, or is it the company they sell those rights away?
Well, I work on all the Rankin Bass things as far as photo licensing and things like that.
Uh-huh.
Universal owns the early specials for distribution, and Warner Brothers owns the later things. And then some of them were independently done, like Mad Monster Party and The Daydreamer and so forth. So there's a lot of different rights holders, but there a lot of times the wrong people are doing the licensing
Yeah.
because they don't own the characters.
Mm.
No. And as you probably know, with Marvel Comics, Jack Kirby created a lot of those characters visually.
Yeah.
Stan Lee wrote them. So in the case of Rankin Bass, Romeo Muller was the primary writer, and then Paul Coker Jr. was the creator of the look of the characters, and Paul Coker Jr. gave me those rights before he passed away. So it's a little more complicated with Rankin Bass than it is with other studios. Not one outfit owns everything.
Okay, so let me just ask you then before we end this. You had mentioned the Snow and the Heat Miser song, which I guess that's what you'd call them, the Snow Miser and the Heat Miser songs. That they were in your top five. What are the other four songs that you would put in your top five from the Rankin Bass specials?
Oh, well, definitely put one foot in front of the other. From Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Any song from Here Comes Peter Cottontail. If I could only get back to yesterday, I kind of like that one. And then I love the song Even a Miracle Needs a Hand in 'Twas the Night Before Christmas.
And 'Twas the Night Before, wasn't that was animated, cell animation, wasn't it?
Right, right. That particular special at Christmas time, I could watch it 5 or 7 times. I just love the music in that one.
And what's your fifth song that you would pick?
Oh, I love all the songs in Mad Monster Party, so it probably would be one of those. The Mummy, maybe. The one that they do at the party.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for spending over an hour speaking about it. I will link to the Rankin Bass site for both the merchandise and the products, and as well as your page specifically. So it was really enjoyable speaking with you. And just final question: what is the next book that you're going to be working on regarding them?
Well, I have 7 books out now, so I'm taking a little break, but I had thought about doing a book on the collectibles because a lot of people don't know this, but prior to my first book coming out in 1997, there was 0 merchandise on Rudolph, Frosty, Santa Claus is Coming to Town. There was nothing. And I got a phone call right after my book came out from Stuffins, who did the beanbag dolls for CVS pharmacies. So my book inspired all of the merchandise that you see today. You can go to any store, Menards, anywhere, and find Rankin Bass merchandise. So I thought about maybe chronicling most of the merchandise because I was involved with a lot of it. So that's probably going to be my next book.
Well, again, I want to just thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.